God is eternal. His character is good. Throughout eternity, God's character has defined good and evil. So you use your rational mind and you use experience. My atheist and agnostic friends hold that good is evil. Good is good and evil is evil. But their holding to that is incompatible with their worldview that says there is no intelligent mind prior to the human mind.
Right.
There is no God.
While I find the evidence for God compelling, my deeper struggle lies in believing that Jesus is God.
Yes.
One of my main obstacles is that the resurrection, the central claim of Christianity, seems to rely entirely on sources from within the Bible itself,
Yes.
particularly the Gospels.
Yes.
How can we be confident in the resurrection of Christ when we don't have strong, external, or independent corroboration? For example, Paul's reference to 500 witnesses is often cited, but he's the only source who mentions them. And even then, how do we know those people existed or were credible? Claims of group visions or appearances happen in other religions too, like people reporting visions of Mary. How do we discern truth from social or psychological phenomena, especially when such claims come from ancient, illiterate cultures prone to myth-making, as Richard Dawkins points out in The God Delusion? Why didn't Jesus provide clearer or more universally verifiable evidence, especially knowing how radical the call to follow him is? I want to give him everything, but this lingering doubt holds me back. Why would a loving God leave such critical matters so open to interpretation, especially when the stakes are so high?
The Gospels that we have in English today have nothing to do with a telephone game. The Gospels that we have in English today are based on over 5,800 Greek manuscripts or pieces of manuscript dated from the 2nd through the 10th century AD, all agreeing to an infinitesimal degree. Secondly, we have approximately 10,000 Latin Vulgate handwritten manuscripts of the Gospels. Thirdly, we have over 9,300 manuscripts in Syrian, Slavic, Gothic, Ethiopic, Coptic, and Armenian, 9,300. And then we have 38,289 quotations of the Gospels in the early church fathers from the 2nd to the 4th century AD. We have an incredibly high degree of certainty that we really have what was written in the 1st century by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Therefore, I cannot prove the Bible's a word of God. I wouldn't want to waste your time or my time trying. But the overwhelming evidence is the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are historically reliable. Don't read them as the word of God if you don't believe that. No problem. Simply be open-minded, read them as historical narrative, and ask yourself, does the historical evidence of his life, teachings, death, and resurrection point to Christ being the truth or not? Based on that evidence, you make your own decision.
Some doubts that I've been having is with Cosmic Skeptic and Bart Ehrman.
Yeah,
they
Bart
always
Ehrman,
talk
yeah.
about like what I was kind of mentioning, right? Like with the that like, okay, yeah, Paul says that there was 500 people who claim to see Jesus alive, but it's only like Paul writing that, right? And like that's why that's one person, and it could have not been true. And I feel like it's such a big claim to follow Jesus. Jesus calls for us to radically follow him, right?
Correct.
And like I just struggle because I want to make sure that Jesus is truly God. I believe in God, and I think that God definitely exists, but I just want to make sure Jesus is truly God and who he claimed to be. Because I feel like, yes, he was a good teacher, right? But you have to understand, he got all these years of education as a Jew, right? He learned all this stuff, and he was aware of what they taught, like in that day, and he understood the scriptures. So it could have been that he was truly just like,
all right, fine, I got it. Thank you,
repeating
sir.
what he said. Yeah.
You have to be very careful when you say, I have to have enough evidence. I have to be able to know certainly enough. Got to be real careful. Healthy skepticism is good. Hyperskepticism is lethal. A hyperskeptic cannot trust, because a hyperskeptic is a cynic who basically says, I have a very negative view of reality. Because there are criminals and liars out there, I can't trust anybody. you'll be a very lonely, isolated person. So the first question you're going to have to work through is, when you ask for enough evidence for the resurrection of Christ, how on earth do you define enough? Because we can always play the game. Sorry, I didn't see Jesus risen from the dead. Sorry, it's not on video. Sorry, we don't have 10,000 people who are all eyewitnesses. Sorry, Pontius Pilate never converted because he saw Christ risen from the dead. We can always play that game. So the question you got to answer is, first of all, what is enough? And I would argue that the answer to that question is God's Holy Spirit working deep in your heart so that you're open. There is no one so narrow-minded as an open-minded blankety blank. To be open-minded means you're going to be realistic. You're going to be honest. You can't prove anything. So don't give me this rubbish that, oh, unless I can prove Christ is risen from the dead, I can't believe. I can't prove to you that your mother's not going to drop arsenic in your tea when you go home next time. It's possible. She might drop arsenic in your tea. But the overwhelming evidence is, hopefully, your mother does love you. That's why you don't chemically analyze the tea before you drink it. So, what's enough? And I would argue that over 500 people, as Paul records in 1 Corinthians 15, seeing Christ. I would argue that the gospel presentation of Christ, really dead. Roman soldier takes a spear and jams it into his side, and an issue of watery serum flows out separate from clotted blood. They take the body of Christ off the cross. They put it in a tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. This is not a secret tomb. Well-known political figure, Joseph of Arimathea. They roll a stone in front of the tomb, and the disciples are not believers. They're Christ deniers, Christ betrayers, Christ deserters. He's put in that tomb. 3 days later, he appears, according to the Gospels, to a group of grief-torn women, like Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and others. And then over a period of 40 days, he appears to over 500 people who see him risen from the dead. So, the evidence is, historically, from the historical narrative of the Gospels, that he really died, he was really buried, and then 3 days later, he really rose from the dead.
I would agree that the atheist doesn't really have a coherent framework
Right.
which they can use
Thank
good
you.
and evil. That's correct.
Yep.
But for me, the kind of tension is, you're saying concepts of good and evil come from God.
Yep.
Isn't that also just kind of a tautological part where that's just in the definition? You
No.
kind of just defined
Here's
it.
why. My experience of life is good and evil exist. And the best worldview that describes my experience of life, which includes good and evil, is there's an eternal God whose character is good, whose character defines that. In other words, there's no standard that's absolute outside of God. God is eternal. His character is good. Throughout eternity, God's character has defined good and evil. So you use your rational mind and you use experience. My atheist and agnostic friends hold that good is evil. Good is good and evil is evil. But their holding to that is incompatible with their worldview that says there is no intelligent mind prior to the human mind.
Right.
There is no God. So their lifestyle is incompatible with their worldview. That's a major problem. Real simple, it's this. The biology professor stands up in the morning at UMass Amherst and says, we're all beasts. We're all animals. That's all we are. No God. We're the result of the evolutionary cycle. He goes home at night, or she goes home at night, sits in front of the television or the computer screen, and sees Hamas, Hezbollah, and Israel fighting each other like cats and dogs. And that biology professor reels back and says, how horrible, how evil. That is a contradiction of what they taught in the morning.
Right.
If it is true that we're all beasts, then don't give me this gibberish about Hamas, Hezbollah, and Israel whooping up on each other as being objectively, absolutely evil. No, it's not. It's relatively evil from your perspective.
Right.
I myself am a bit of a skeptic, and
Good.
one of the main things that sort of drives that is I think about life and how finite and short it is, and
Yes.
I don't understand how you can justify eternal punishment based on a short life.
Very good. You can't. You cannot justify it. But you know what's even harder? To justify why God would love you and me in spite of the fact that we basically spit in his face, rebelled against him, and gone our own way. See, that's what I appreciate about Stephen Hawking, who by the end of his life said there can't be a God. Why, Stephen Hawking, can there not be a God? His answer, because the universe is too big. All right, fair enough. But I can promise you, Stephen, if there is a God who created this universe, which is so big you can't believe God exists, but if there is a God who created this really, really big universe, to think that he loves me and has the hairs of my head numbered, that's arrogance. Human arrogance to the hype. Or else it's the truth. And if there is a God who created this really vast, humongous universe, for him to love you and me is absurd. He doesn't need you. He definitely does not need me. But that is exactly what Jesus Christ communicated. If I choose to live my life separate from God, I'm going to spend eternity separate from him? Whoa, that's pretty intense. Yeah, but let's be real honest. God does not encourage irresponsibility. God does not encourage trivializing your life. Why does he put so much responsibility on those two shoulders, on these two shoulders, that the decisions I make in this life have eternal ramifications? Whoa, that's pretty intense. Stuart?
And it gets to the fundamental piece of why not extend life for 2,000 years? And then is that enough to decide whether to have eternal life or not? Whether the maker can truly decide that for you? I don't think it makes any kind of difference, because you're going to extend out and out and out. Then it becomes tremendously random and arbitrary. Secondly, that again is getting at religion versus what Jesus Christ does for us in our hearts. Remember, religion is all about, are you going to live good enough in order to get to God? Versus Jesus Christ is saying, no, you'll never get there. You could live 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years. You'll never get there. You'll keep messing up. And I think sociological, psychological studies probably show that, right? Backs up what Christ says. And so he's saying, I can judge as the God of the universe your decision right here, right now, thief on the cross, whether you're going to make an eternal type of decision out of the heart or out of the actions and trying to justify yourself to work to God or to work your way to hell ultimately and saying, screw you, God, get away from me. I'm going to live my own kind of way. And so it's all about, that's why Jesus was always reading hearts. He wasn't reading actions. The Pharisees were coming. They looked like glamorous people. They were tithing more than the average person. They were doing acts of justice. They were squeaky clean from the outside. But their father was the devil once you looked inside the cup, because they were chewed up with evil and their motives were all wrong. It was all self-prideful, ego-driven in order to do even what seemed to be good things. So God judges us. Yes, it's tough. Based off of X amount of years, it seems very short, but he's the God of the universe who can look at your heart and say, I know what you're going to decide now and what you would decide 1,000 years from now.
But what about the way that Christianity has been weaponized for like colonialism, like throughout the world? It's been used like to forcibly convert like indigenous peoples, or it's been used for like decimating or like colonizing other countries. Is that not also considered violence as well?
Yeah, that absolutely is considered violence.
So would that?
Do you think that's hypocritical?
I don't think it's hypocritical per se, but to say that.
Okay, but if you're not saying it's hypocritical, then you're saying that Jesus would promote that.
I'm not
Jesus
saying.
promotes colonialism?
No,
Okay.
It's people who have like taken his teachings, who have used it as like a form of violence. But I felt like the statement of atheistic. I'm not saying that like violence should be measured in terms of numbers. That's utilitarianism.
Yep.
But like to say that it's caused more violence than like crimes perpetuated by religion, I feel like doesn't consider the scope of the way that religion has been used as a vehicle of colonialism in the past.
So, I mean, every single society, ma'am, has had slavery. Modern day slavery is just as atrocious as any form of slavery in the past as well, whether that's sex slavery or whether it's any type of labor-based slavery, right? And so every single major, check me on your history on this, every single major abolitionist movement was done by Christians historically, based off of the teachings of Christ. So I would just plead with you, yes, I could take a butter knife that I was buttering my bread with this morning. I had way too much of my wife's homemade bread this morning, and I could have taken it and I could have stuck it in my dad. Now, he could have stuck it in me then. Okay, what am I getting at here? The butter knife is meant to butter bread. It's not meant to stick it in my dad, him to stick it into me, or to stick it into anybody else. anything can be caused and be used for an abuse. And so colonialists, you're right, many of them, whether it was peddling Christianity, Islam, secular humanism, anything can be abused and taken advantage of. Look at Constantine, 325 AD. Constantine saw Christianity was growing so quickly and said, I'm going to hop in there. I'm going to use Christianity for my own ends in order to secure political power. So Christianity has always been adopted and bastardized for wrong reasons. But fortunately, if you look most sociological studies, you'll see that every time Christianity grows too much in power, like political power, it goes to seed eventually. That's what I love about it. Because Jesus Christ says, I'm not about power ultimately. You can use me for a little bit, but just watch. My central message is humility. And so when that occurs, the powerful are not going to be able to just take it and run with their own agenda forever without it eventually falling apart. Because Christ was all about humility.
Yeah, I mean, I can see what you mean. Yes, like people definitely use ideologies as a way to like abuse it.
Yeah.
So, but I don't necessarily think that only positioning Christianity as like the be all end all when it comes to like altruism or humanism, because I understand there are ideologies such as like
Agreed.
Christian.
Yep.
I agree. I understand there are like ideologies such as like Christian democracy that are more popular in like places like Europe that have been, and in particular, like even though like I don't necessarily agree with the Catholic Church, they do like the actions of some of the papacy have like moved the pendulum forward.
Okay.
So I totally understand that like ideologies can be used, and can be like used and abused, but I don't know if it's like the best thing to only position like one religion as like the be all end all when it comes to like everything that's done.
No, I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree with more. So again, don't judge Christianity based off of the great things it's done, hospitals, for example, and what Mother Teresa did, for example, or the abolitionist movements. I mean, I could go on and on. Or with what it did against eugenics. I mean, it's done endless amounts of great stuff, right? Don't judge it based off of that. And don't judge it based off of when it's been abused either. No, judge it based off of who is Jesus, was he reliable, was he a historical figure, did he claim to be God, and was he raised from the dead? And if he fails any one of those, then reject him, and you got nothing to worry about. But if he fulfills those, now you start to understand, wow, I'm going to worship him as Lord, Savior. And he's not just a legend or a liar or a lunatic, like that guy was just saying. So it's not about the ultimate consequences of, although I will say this to you. I will say, if Christianity leaves this country, do I think that there'll be a great purge immediately? No, I don't think so. Do I think that there will be an ultimate purge in a very negative way in decades from now, maybe your great-grandchildren? Yes, absolutely, 110%. Because this nation was based out of Judeo-Christian values, which gave each and every person the right to value and dignity, no matter what they looked like, no matter the gender, no matter the age, no matter the ethnicity. All are created in God's image and given value, objective value. But if you have secular humanism, now it comes into play relativism. You have value sometimes, or you don't have value because you're an illegal immigrant, or you don't have value because, you have Down syndrome in your mother's womb, and we know you're going to be a greater tax on society if you're born. So you don't ultimately have value. So this is atheism. It all turns into moral relativism, and you determine the value however you'd like. I can tell you're dubious over what I'm saying right now, but poke holes in it then.
Atheism means that someone wouldn't see value.
No, I'm saying atheism, if you're logical and consistent with it, it has to buy into a form of moral relativism. There's many different moral theories, but moral relativism, which says you determine the value of an individual and you determine ultimately what is right or wrong for you. And so our culture could say, antebellum, this man right now has less value than you. I know you're shocked right now, but I promise slavery was actually a real thing.
I'm aware of that.
Okay, well, don't be shocked then, because that's what our culture said at one point. So who's to say? See, our hearts didn't just become better. It was the culture that determined it. And ultimately, Judeo-Christian values came in, and Jesus Christ, Paul in Galatians 3:28 said that there's neither slave nor free. That's why Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, so many others, Abraham Lincoln himself said, the only obvious sin is slavery. So all I'm saying is based off of what Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., all these guys said. I'm just agreeing with them because it makes the most sense to me. There's moral obligation, which is above your opinion of value of an individual, mine, above culture or above the powerful. So Trump, Biden, anybody. Above them. Thank heaven for that. So they can't change the value of an individual.
You've been talking a lot about how like it would relate to like moral relativism, but like I don't necessarily see how someone not necessarily believing in a deity or like some sort of God informs their entire moral belief system. And also like people who have practiced Christianity have also, like, as I mentioned with like colonialism, they've used Christianity as a way to subjugate like other people in like Africa or like Asia. So it has also been used to like demean people's values before.
And I could weaponize you right now and say that you're being racist towards me.
Okay.
Because I'm a white male. Would that be honest? No, that wouldn't be honest. You're treating me in a very polite, kind, thoughtful kind of way. Just like you or any colonialist better be honest about who Jesus is and how he revealed himself and how the Bible reveals him to be, rather than, oh, he's the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, 6'1", nice American Jesus wrapped up in an American flag. That's the Jesus that I want. Is that being honest to who Jesus was 2,000 years ago in Palestine? In Jerusalem? I don't think so. So we got to treat him for who he is, what he taught, how he lived. So the colonialists, I hope you disagree with. I hope you disagree with much of ISIS. I hope you disagree with Mao Zedong and others who I talked about from more of an atheistic standpoint. I hope you disagree with many of these. But then you got to look back to, okay, what is motivating them ultimately? And what are they connecting themselves with to push them towards how and why they're acting the way they are? That's why Thomas Jefferson himself, he had slaves, not agreeing with him. And he eventually, at the end of his life, thankfully said it was wrong of him to have slaves, thank heaven. But don't forget, Declaration of Independence, what did he say? All men, I wish he included women, all men have rights, a right to liberty, happiness, God-given, he said. Then Benjamin Franklin came in as an atheist and said, oh, no, we're not going to say God-given. It's just going to say unalienable, or more so kind of a humanistic perspective. But what he's saying is all have value, no matter what you look like, no matter what kind of abilities you have, all have value no matter what. And he was taking that right from Jesus Christ, the Judeo-Christian value system, and that's where our understanding of the value of human life and our judicial system comes from. It wasn't Aristotle, wasn't Plato, wasn't the Greeks, wasn't the Romans, wasn't the Assyrians. It was the Judeo-Christian worldview. And I think you live out of that worldview a lot more than you realize.
I mean, I wasn't really raised with it, but I did grow up going to church. But that's not what informed my values, and I'm not going to get into that because my question wasn't really answered of, like, why do you believe that that someone being like an atheist or being like a non-believer automatically means that they cannot like have a moral system? And also currently, I mean.
No, it's a great question. When Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, all things are permissible, he wasn't saying if you don't believe in God, you're a horrible person and you're going to do all kinds of evil things. What he was saying is, logically, it follows if there's no moral obligation, oughts and shoulds and duties that's outside of just your culture, them determining it, then ultimately you get to decide what is right or wrong. That's why Jeffrey Dahmer, in 60 Minutes, when he was interviewed, said, I'm an atheist. I don't believe there's any heaven or hell. I don't believe there's no moral obligation or no God above the rule system that we have as a society. So I just live out my own truth. And my own truth is to kill people and eat them. So don't judge me for it. Jeffrey Dahmer, right there, boom, consistent atheist. Not because he was a mass murderer, serial killer. I'm not saying that. I have atheist friends who are better than me ethically, okay? They live out in a more ethical kind of way than me. But I'm just saying it doesn't follow if you're going to say someone has objective value, meaning purpose. If you say to me, hey, you ought not to have demeaned me in some kind of way. If you say to me, hey, Stuart, you ought to go help that boy in Myanmar who's starving to death. You ought to help him. Why ought I? From whose perspective? Yours? You keep going at consequences, but anything can be abused, right?
But isn't religion also sort of relative as well? Because if you only say, I'm going to do this because a God said I'm going to do this, is that not also like relative, like morality as well?
Great point. Okay, so again, I'm not saying that as well. Who Martin Luther King Jr. said in letters from a Birmingham jail, when he said there's a law above the law, he's saying the reason why I'm pushing back against so much racism here in Alabama is because ultimately there's a law above the law, just like there's mathematical laws. We did not invent gravity and mathematical laws. They were there in place. Now, we took from them things like the Pythagorean theorem that we did tie together, but they've always existed. So just like mathematical laws, the moral law has always existed. Well, if it's always existed, someone must have put it there, no? Did it just randomly pop up? I don't think so. And so what Martin Luther King Jr. is saying is, start to look at that and say, hey, there really are moral oughts and shoulds. And racism is always wrong. Slavery is always wrong. And so he's not just saying, just believe in a God because a God says so. That's not what he's saying. Because to your point, I wouldn't believe that either. That doesn't make any sense. But he's talking about a moral law, and yes, there needs to be a moral lawgiver if there is objective moral law out there that's above what you say, what I say, what culture says, and what the powerful says. Ultimately what that moral law says, and there has to be a moral lawgiver who I would say is God. Not the Christian God. We would get to that later.
But how do you know that my moral system only came from God if this is something, because I wasn't necessarily raised with religion even though I went to a church. So how did that, how do my moral, how do you know that someone's moral, like, someone's moral compass only comes from a deity?
Well, this is what Paul said in Romans 1 and 2. 1, the creativity and beauty from this world, and 2, from the moral conscience within us. You knowing what is ultimately right or wrong.
So it's me who determines my moral.
That God has put in you. Because just like your ability to say, hey, math, 2 plus 2, objectively, not based off of your own interpretation, objectively 2 plus 2 equals 4. Objectively, just as much so as 2 plus 2 equals 4, objectively, you should not treat this man in a racist way.
Yeah.
Okay, how do you get to that point of objectively? And I love your consistency. You're saying you can't. You're saying you can't. You said it's up to me. I have to reflect on that a little bit more. But then everything in you, you know, says, no, we should live to fight against racism. So do you see the contradiction? You said, I have to reflect on that a little more, and it's up to me. I'm sorry, but I'm very glad that it's not up to you, his worth and value. I'm very glad it's not up to me, because you and I are both a mix of good and evil.
I don't think the comparison to math and humanity is necessarily the best comparison, because humanity is a lot more complex and complicated. Like, for example, in some religions, it's very much against people's morality to kill and eat certain animals, whereas in other religions, it's not. So, like, how do you determine which one is right or not? But like, I just think in general, like something like 2 plus 2 and religion can't really be compared because of how complex and like complicated humans are.
Okay, but this is my whole point, though. You brought up different religious practices that different cultures sometimes have, right? All right. You are not white and Western, but I think you are Western, right?
Sure.
Were you born? Oh, sure. You either are or you're not. But let's use you as an example. As a Westerner, you go over to certain tribes in Africa, right? And this is true for a white Western woman who was running an op-ed for the New York Times. She went down and she said, genital mutilation is wrong. And they scoffed at her and they said, who are you to tell us that? She came back disillusioned as an atheist and she said, they're exactly right. I can't come down here as a white Western woman and simply say, hey, stop doing genital mutilation, because I'm just saying that based off of my own culture. Their culture says something different, so who am I? I'm just being ethnocentric and tremendously ego-driven.
Other people get their morals and beliefs from many other places. Where, sure, I don't know what's inherent. I don't know why it's inherent that like you should give someone like food when they're hungry, or that you should help starving people who are starving. Certainly right now in our government, people don't believe that like people who are starving or sick should get help. But I don't necessarily think that by increasing religion or by increasing a certain teaching that is necessarily going to that's necessarily going to like be the end all be all to improving everything because
You're talking about ethical systems and teachings of faith. I'm talking about the moral argument, which is one of the strongest arguments for a God, not the Christian God, any God, monotheistic God, which is above your truth, culture's truth, the powerful truth, right? Which is above utilitarianism, all the systems of ethics.
How do you know
That there is a God. Well, I don't know it for a fact. There's no way to prove it, but I think it by far and away makes the most sense because in all of my experience, when an individual has said, I have the truth, there's immense amount of contradictions and they can change at any old time and it doesn't line up with experience. Or if it's the culture, then we're going to be racist because we're in power and we're Caucasian and you're black. Or it's the powerful Hitler saying, based off of evolution and what Nietzsche taught, strong eat the weak. So the Jews, they're the weaker one, the white Aryan race. We are powerful. We are the thoroughbreds. So we are going to dump on them. Do you see all the contradictions and the dangers in all three of those? And you have to pick one versus the God of the universe, which is, no, there are moral oughts and shoulds and obligations and duties that you always have to abide by. So the genital mutilation that's done by the culture in Africa is wrong. Or living a life where you are deciding to kill in the mother's womb a child who barely has autism because that child's going to be a tax on society, that's wrong. Okay, Down syndrome kids are some of the happiest children I know. They lift me up more than any other kid, really. I have a couple of close friends who are Down syndrome. And at church, every single Sunday, I get more hugs than maybe I even want to from them. But they're so incredibly huggable, loving. I mean, everything about them wants to exist. And yet, in the culture, whether it's this culture or the Netherlands, you give the culture the moral power, and now all of a sudden they'll say, well, they're a tax on society. Or at this point they have value, but at this point in time, nah, we're going to say they don't have value. But the moral argument, if there is a God, is above culture saying, no, they have value no matter who's in power. No matter what you say, no matter what I say, they always have value. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching this episode. Hit that subscribe button. We'd love for you to join the family. Also, want to invite you to our church in New Canaan, Connecticut. It's New Canaan High School and it meets Sundays at 9:30 a.m.